Hello, my name is Jacob Gerard, and I'm here to talk about reconciliation in healthcare. Now, this is a very random topic for me to cover, but I'm covering this because this is part of my English First Peoples 12 class. Now, I'm going to be talking about first, who am I and why am I interested in this? Because I'm going to be going into the medical field, specifically radiology. Now, seeing how this inclusivity and the different biases that people have in the medical field could really help me maintain a good interactions and relationships with my clients that I will see in the future. So, me being a student right now covering this is why I'm here, and also to learn more about Indigenous peoples and what struggles they face, specifically in the medical field. Now, on the agenda today, as clearly you can see right there, is first the leading question. That's what we're going to be covering, the question that cascades through the whole assignment. First of all, though, in the actual meat of the subject, we're going to be talking about the calls to action from the 94 calls to action that will kind of shape the model of the assignment. Next, we're going to be talking about the past, the present, and the future of reconciliation in Canada. Now, obviously, the past did not have many specific reconciliation ideals because, I mean, that just wasn't part of it. It's only been the present and hopefully the future that this will happen. Now, with all that said, let's get started. How is reconciliation facilitated in the healthcare industry, and how has it been seen in the past, present, and future? That is my question for today, and this is how we're going to be covering it. First of all, as I just said in the agenda, the 94 calls to action. Now, as you can see here, uh, this is Article 18 of the 94 calls to action. We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is a direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools, and to recognize and implement the health care rights of Aboriginal people as identified in international law, constitutional law, and under the treaties. Now, I specifically chose this to be one of the things that encapsulate my project because uh, it shows the past of how it got affected. Now, of course, this is the first part of the agenda, the first meat of the issue, actually, the past, present, and future, this being the past. So it shows that we need to acknowledge, first of all, what happened in the past so that we can really confront it in the present and in the future. This is why this is all going on, actually. This is the basis of why we need reconciliation, because of the horrible things that happened to the Indigenous peoples and all the different kinds of Indigenous peoples in the past. Now, this is the second article from the 94 calls to action that I'm going to be covering. It is Article 19. We call upon the federal government, in consultation with Aboriginal peoples, to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes, calls to actions between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal communities, and to publish annual progress reports and assess long-term trends. Such efforts would focus on indicators such as infant mortality. We talk about that a little bit later in the slideshow. Maternal health, suicide, mental health, we talk about that as well, addictions, life expectancy, birth rates, infant mortality, child health issues, chronic diseases, we talk about that as well, illness and injury incidents, and the availability of appropriate health services. Now, this is also very important because, as I'm sure you can see where this is going, this is the present of the issue going on. So it's really talking about how, and we'll talk about this later as well, that in present times, we're obviously striving a lot more to grow in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and really talking about it more by specifically hosting lectures, per se, and also hosting educational services like EFP 12. You could give that as an example. So this is really trying to showcase the importance of putting the education into the world so that this, one, won't happen again, and two, that we can recover from this and hopefully grow a healthier Canada as a whole, including the Indigenous peoples, of course. Now, the third and final article here, right now, before we get to the actual fun part of the assignment, is Article 22. We call upon those who can effect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders where requested by Aboriginal patients. Now, this article itself is kind of close-minded, not in its actual context of the whole 94 calls to action, but in the context of my slideshow, because we do talk a little bit about the importance of Aboriginal healing practices and their benefits to the Indigenous peoples and their mental health, of course, how this plays in. It's very obvious. Religion is very good at helping people, so we're going to be talking about that as well. But also, since this follows the trend of past, present, and future, this is obviously the future, showing that we're calling on the people who can affect the change to affect the change, right? And we go over this in the future vision of what Canada would be like, hopefully, in the reconciliation process. And this specifically is a good, it encapsulates the message of what I'm about to talk about. Now, finally, the meat of the issue, the past of reconciliation in healthcare. Now, there are lots of historical examples of the horrible things that have happened to Indigenous peoples in the past, and this is a couple of them. Now, the colonial diseases like smallpox, measles, dysentery, of course, devastated the Indigenous peoples. Now, this is very clearly tied to healthcare and healthcare now, because the past of how it affected the Indigenous people really goes to shape how we treat them now. So we originally, right, when the colonists came over, they gave smallpox, measles, and dysentery, and in doing so, decimated populations, decimated even species, right? Because we also came in with different animal viruses, and this specifically was a large toll on Indigenous health. Now, the colonial practices like incarceration, reservations, and residential schools all made an incredibly detrimental impact on not only mental health, of course, from the obvious abuses that happen in all these things, but also in physical health, because they are stripped from their actual grounds that they used to live in and forced into residential schools. And their children are forced into residential schools, and the overall populations were forced onto reservations, which is their different grounds. Next is incarceration, of course. They also did starvation. They would starve the Indigenous people, and also use less expenses to provide help for their social services. They were seen as less than, of course. I mean, it was those old times where, racism was much more prolific than it is now, though, of course, it's not wiped out. And there was a lot less expenses given to Indigenous and social services, to Indigenous social services. So this obviously has had a great impact. Now, you might be wondering, what does health service permits mean? Now, as we talked about, the social services were kind of forced onto them, even though they weren't that good. So people would obviously try to escape that horrible system that they were forced into, that social service system. But to do that, they needed a permit. Now, this permit, right, it went through, to get it, you actually had to do a million different things well, not actually a million for logistics sake, but you had to go through quite a lot of steps to actually get it, and then you might just get denied at the end of it. So not only if you needed health service, it was probably pretty urgent, right? If you're going this far to get better social services. right, at that time. And so you could probably have days in that time to live. But if you had to jump through all these hoops, and also might get denied, uh, then you're kind of out of luck. So it was obviously not a very good thing, and that's an understatement. It was a horrible thing to force these social services not only onto the indigenous peoples, but also to offer regular health services, but at such a high cost that it was very impractical. Uh, and these are just some historical examples. Now, the conclusions that come from this, obviously, is that this one quote from a great source is colonial practices like starvation, incarceration, community confinement to reserves, and child removal to schools, those are residential schools obviously, all had an enormous unequal impact on Canadian Indigenous peoples' health and well-being. Now, this is from a certain study that came out in 2018, and it was a study done that overviewed a large, overreaching problem that was going on with indigenous peoples, and the results of it clearly showed that the indigenous people, uh, due to such horrible circumstances that they were shown in specifically the last slide, they were poorly treated, right? And it came back to haunt them that people nowadays specifically are discriminated against because of their race. They're seen as less than and they don't belong here. Like they're drains on the system. Like how most people stigmatize, uh, this is not relating them to these people, but how people normally, right? If you see or a drug addicted person and you see them there all the time, right? You think, oh, they're just here for drugs or something, right? And that's the mentality of what happened in the past, right? And hopefully not now, but obviously there are some cases of recent times that have shown this to be wrong. But it's happened in the past that they just thought they were drains on the system trying to get all the kinds of drugs that they could, and so it was obviously an incredibly racist and untrue statement that people usually had in their minds. And so they were discriminated against, and they act like they don't belong here, right? Because if people didn't believe that they were like, if people didn't believe indigenous people were drug addicts, they usually thought that they were too tough for medicine, right? And so they were like, you can just walk it off, right? And so you usually had these two sides of the spectrum that really marginalize these people to where uh, in those times and in recent times, hopefully this can be in the past, that people were discriminated against just because they were indigenous. Now, that last point, it was a great example that I saw in this one study, that when the stigma around chronic diseases paired with the racism, the natural racism that people felt, they combined to just boost the issue, right? So the stigma around it that, this man has diabetes, it's all his fault. Yeah, he's just fat, It's like all that, and this person has some uh, chronic disease like cancer. Ah, probably something happened, right? And then you intersect with that racism, it just magnifies it. Now, this was a great point posed by a certain study that I read, and it's the same study that I've had for the slides so far. And that quote. Now, this is the present of reconciliation in healthcare. The present afflictions on First Nations people specifically, we're going to be talking about the Métis and the Inuit as well, because that's what the NCCIH has been talking about. Specifically, the Chief of Public Health Officers report in 2021, how they came forward with a review on Indigenous people specifically. So it talks about that, and specifically this, the First Nations people were, according to them, First Nations peoples are well known for having large disparities in poverty, adequate housing, and food insecurity. These all add to health issues in their communities. Now, this is a very obvious statement, but to expound upon this, the Indigenous peoples, given that they have been marginalized and all that, they really don't have any opportunity to grow out of that, right? And so what we're doing now, and as we talk about later in the future events, future processes in the reconciliation process, we talk about how the new vision is that we will not only get rid of those disparities, but also talk about them and educate people on them so that we can grow as a whole community rather than just Canadians and Indigenous people. We can merge and become united, you know, and have that same kind of mentality of unity and equality, right? Now, there are different determinants which lead to this poverty and inadequate housing, and that's specifically socioeconomic issues. Now, these socioeconomic issues all have their origin in the past, which was my main point in the beginning of the slideshow, was that the past obviously shows the issues of the present and how we can change them in the future. And of all these, because people couldn't work, what little work they had, because the unemployment rate in Indigenous cultures is so much higher because they're just so remote areas, and other such reasons, but I'm not going to get into that right now. COVID-19 saw a rise where people just became more poor, and when you're poor, you can't afford good food, right? And so it leads to food insecurity, as it is said there, and bad housing, right? So people would not have adequate housing to survive in their reservations, which usually didn't have enough electricity to begin with, not enough good water to begin with. So all of it just multiplied, and COVID specifically saw a great rise in these disparities. And this is one quote, really good quote. First Nations health is synonymous with mental health challenges and intergenerational trauma. That's the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health talking there. It's saying how it reflects not only on how we view it, but also on how it kind of actually is. Because their health, it's not very healthy. That's like to say the least. Now, we're going on to a bit more on this, which is Bill C-15, which aimed at aligning Canadian law with UN DRIP regulations, was received with royal assent in June of 2021. This furthered the discussions and actions revolving around supplying the First Nations peoples with appropriate tools to regain their health. And there's a quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In particular, Indigenous peoples have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining health, housing, and other economic and social programs affecting them, and, as far as possible, to administer programs through their own institutions. Now, this is advocating, obviously, for their own individuality in helping themselves grow as well. So it's not just, as a lot of people say today, oh, we just give them all our money, like they're just drains, like I just said in the past, right? In the past slides, right? But it's actually advocating for their individuality as well, and their emancipation from relying on us, even though they don't do that now because we don't give them much in the first place, which is a horrible, horrible tragedy. Now, we're obviously working along that with the Bill C-15 and with a bunch of different talking points that I'm going to be talking about in the next slides. How the discussions are being furthered, the actions are being furthered, and although it may be slow, it's getting somewhere, and we need to keep pushing. Now, this is the Métis people. With little help for betterment and few statistics on record, this is actually said clearly in a source that the Métis people are very loosely organized into different statistics. We just don't cover it for some reason. But what we do have, right? Because we don't just ignore them, but we could obviously work on helping them more. What we do have shows that the Métis have higher rates of chronic diseases like diabetes, lung cancer, heart disease, and stroke, and are extra vulnerable to mental health disorders, food insecurity, and poverty. The main determinants of these include low quality housing, healthcare issues, and food insecurity. Now, all of these can play a huge part in all of these because if you have food insecurity, right, you're probably going to have some kind of heart disease or diabetes because what little food you do have is not good for you because it's cheap, right? And also healthcare issues. This includes health, mental and physical. It can make you extra vulnerable to mental health disorders and other types of food insecurity and poverty. Now, let's go back to that left paragraph there. What has been clearly found is that the Métis population clearly lacks the supportive care that non-Indigenous peoples have, and that their rates of almost every malady is increased just for supposedly being Métis. Right? On to the Inuit. The Inuit people are some of the least healthy, underfunded, and unaided Indigenous peoples in Canada, partially because they're so far north, which we force them there, obviously. And the current statistics can be directly correlated to socioeconomic issues like high rates of poverty, inadequate housing, substance use, and poor quality foods. Now, they're so far north that a lot of the communities are only able to be given stuff and helped by planes. So this is a really difficult area for them because it's just so not only is the food low quality, usually, because it's store-bought crap, like processed garbage that they get, so they have to hunt more than what they buy, which hunting is good. Hunting is good, and they do well in that practice. But the food that they do get is probably low quality and low quality from us, the processed foods, and it's killer expensive. And the Inuit people, according to statistics, 300 times more more tuberculosis than non-Indigenous communities. 300 times. No, I didn't read that wrong. 300 times. That is absurd. Lives are 12.2 years shorter on average than non-Indigenous communities and have 3 times more infant mortality than non-Indigenous communities. This is a horrible statistic. Horrible. These people are being so underfunded and so unaided that they have these kinds of horrible drawbacks in it. Now, the conclusions from these is that it's clear that it's not simply a personal issue, right? Across all three, right? Maybe if one community was like this, maybe it would be a personal thing. Maybe. Even then, that might be a little racist, right? So, from these, but all three of them, and the majority of Indigenous peoples, right? All the different kinds in our beautiful Canada, all three have such large disparities. Now, this is obviously not just them. Obviously not. It's due to socioeconomic issues, right? And it requires the help of everyone, right? Because we are a community, and we give help to the non-Indigenous people of BC, of Alberta, all those people, right? Though we could have better social services. The fact is that not everyone, and a lot of people do, have racist tendencies towards Indigenous peoples and biases. So, those are the conclusions. Now for the future. This is a little bit more hopeful than what we just had. That was kind of a downer. Current lectures. This is a great quote. Our goal is to guide and inspire a process to work to renew relationships on a basis of inclusion, mutual respect, mutual understanding, and respect. Now, this is from specifically the Indigenous Atlas, which is a good source for diving into this kind of stuff. Now, between 2009 and 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada hosted hundreds of hearings, including national multi-day conferences, 4-day conferences, in Vancouver, Edmonton, Inuvik, Winnipeg, and more, and large regional conferences were held in Whitehorse and Victoria. These put large amounts of time towards gathering documents to show the past disparities in healthcare systems and child welfare reports and how to fix them, right? So these current lectures have greatly spread awareness of the indigenous problems, and through even little lectures, right? Like how just having a conversation in EFP class itself is its own, of course it's a lecture, but it can obviously help us, right, through education. And these are just obviously larger examples of that. Now this is the vision for the future. This is what I was talking about. The Chief Public Health Officer's 2021 health report circulated around Indigenous public health and showed the large disparities in health they face. This report showed that the current public vision for Canada, with input especially from Indigenous voices and leaders. They specifically mentioned that, which I think is good. Even with these statistics and facts at hand, according to the recent study, Ignored to Death, Systematic Racism in the Canadian Health System, health admins and workers believe it is due to personal issues that Indigenous people have such large health disparities. This is a horrible thing, right? Because if you're walking into a clinic because you need help and you're instantly getting judged, obviously that's going to impact not only your experience, which sucks, but also the help you're going to receive. So that's part of it. And then the road to reconciliation requires education to be spread more widely than it is now, because knowledge removes bias. Now what I mean by this is that I think Benjamin Franklin had a good quote on this, that our darkness of ignorance can sometimes leave us like blocking out the light of knowledge, right? And so if we're taught it, we can learn from it. And specifically in the health field, a solution to anti-Indigenous treatment could be to train all employees on anti-bias treatment across all races. Now this is one other conclusion that you could draw, that if we teach everyone about these disparities, it will lead to a much better environment for Indigenous peoples and everyone around us, because it'll affect not only Indigenous peoples if we train them across all races, but it'll affect like all races. That's like the whole point. So in the healthcare field specifically, this is a great opportunity that we could teach people and help them learn. And that's it. Thank you for sticking around. That was good. Now what we can do ourselves, right, is obviously donations help, and that people who are struggling, right, we have to help them in our own different ways, right? Like my grandmother, she makes little quilts for people of those kinds of struggles, right? Little quilts for those people who need blankets, right? Who are cold at night, who maybe sleep on the streets, and specifically for Alzheimer people, but that's not the point of the video. You can do your own little thing. That's what I'm saying, right? So if we all pitch in, right, obviously it can grow at a much higher rate, and we can maybe shrink by a much higher rate the health disparities that are here. Now in the health field, this is very important because compassion obviously should be a staple. And if we don't help the marginalized people in our society, that really shows that we don't know how to help people. So with that all said, hope you enjoyed the presentation, and thank you for watching. My name is Jacob Gerard, and thank you.